This is the first lecture for Wednesday, April 8th. And today we're going to finish talking about nectin and then move on to migration and dispersal. So just to remind you where we are in this course, we're going through these different ecosystems. One of the major ecosystems out there is the open ocean, or oceanic ecosystems. And so we looked at plankton, we looked at phytoplankton and zooplankton, and then we looked at nectin and found that there were a number of interesting aspects of the life of nectin, and they're interesting because they're big and they're charismatic, and that some of the adaptations of nectin that you find in the epipelagic, mesopelagic, and bentopelagic for some species, they have these adaptations that apply in all of those regions of the pelagic, and some other ones that are more specific as you get deeper. And so we looked at bioluminescence being very common in the mesopelagic, those animals that undergo this migration, daily migration, the deep scattering layer that you see on all kinds of sonar from ships. We'll talk about that more when we talk about migration, whether it's a real migration or not. And then we looked at body form and swimming, and saw that everything moves around. All these nectin have some mechanism for moving. And now we're talking about low biomass. So compared to someplace like the coral reef or some of these other ecosystems that we've looked at, salt marshes, very productive, estuaries, very productive. Even in the rocky shore, there's a lot of algae. So we've seen mangroves, mud flats, a lot of ecosystems where there's a lot of primary production. There's a lot of biomass. Now, if you added up all of the primary production in the open ocean, it would be a huge amount. However, on the basis of a per unit area, the amount of energy is rather sparse. There's a huge amount of energy there, but it's not very densely concentrated like it is in some of these other ecosystems that we've looked at. So one of the adaptations that pelagic or oceanic organisms have to deal with is this patchy resources. That there's some places where there's a lot of primary productivity, there's a lot of nutrients, and there's other places where there's not very much energy. There's some places where there's very drastic seasonal changes in the amount of primary production. And when there's nutrients, you have these blooms, you have these population explosions, basically, of phytoplankton and then zooplankton, a very rich, productive area. And we just got through looking at locomotion, or the ability to move, swimming, body form and swimming, and saw that these nectin have the ability to move. They have the ability to move long distances in a short period of time sometimes. So you can respond to these patchy environments by moving, which a lot of marine organisms don't have the luxury of doing. If you're stuck to the rocks, like an urchin or a snail, or if you're a plankton, you can't move faster than the water's moving. So in the open ocean, patchy is this buzzword that describes how resources are distributed in the open ocean. We looked at that before. So there's low biomass in terms of the whole open ocean. As you move deeper, away from the ocean, away from the surface rather, it becomes even more low biomass. When we look at the deep sea, we're going to see that's a big physical, biological condition that deep sea organisms have to deal with. So what do you do to be able to exist in a patchy environment? What do you do? What's your strategy for moving around from one patch to another? Well, there's a number of different mechanisms that you find in Nectin, but two of the main themes are high performance swimmers and high efficiency swimmers. So let's basically look at this as you've got to go from point A to point B. In point A, there's some food, and point B, there's some food. But in between, there's not much to eat. Maybe there's nothing to eat. So you've got to move from point A to point B. So how do you do that? You could swim very quickly from point A to point B. You could get there in a hurry, and then you're there. You have access to this food in a short period of time, so you can be a high performance swimmer. You can cover a lot of area, and when you find prey, you can be very good at capturing that prey. Or you can be more like a blimp that could fly all the way across the country with just a little bit of gas or fuel compared to a jet plane. It would take you a long time to get there, but you'd get there pretty efficiently. So you've got to maximize your ability to travel and the efficiency with which you travel. You're not trying to get there in a hurry necessarily, and you're not necessarily going to be able to capture whatever you want. You're going to have to eat whatever you come across, as opposed to being this very selective feeder that can choose whatever it is you want to eat because you're the fastest thing out there. So those are two main categories of ways that you move around. Let's look at this first group, high performance swimmers. So what do? You swim fast. You cover a lot of distance in a relatively short period of time. So you can move from patch to patch, basically, if you're referencing this in terms of patches. You can feed on whatever it is you want. You can select things that have a high energy density. You can select oily food. You can select food that's rich in energy and not bother with eating lower energy density food. You can skip that. You can be a selective feeder. So in terms of swimming speed, humans that are fast, there was this race of everybody was anticipating the Olympic swimmer Michael Phelps was going to swim against a white shark, and people were all excited to watch it. In the end, it was a bunch of made up. It wasn't even real. It was some cartoon-like made up race. But human swimmers, 3 miles an hour is pretty fast. If you look at some dolphin, can swim very fast. Tuna swim very fast. Billfish, especially sailfish, swim very fast. Some sharks, including mako sharks, killer whales, all of those can swim 25 miles an hour, maybe 30, 40, 50 miles an hour in some cases, probably at least 40 miles an hour. 40 miles an hour is a lot faster than 3 miles an hour. So I don't know why they even had the race between Michael. It's kind of ridiculous to get people to watch Shark Week. So all these different organisms can swim a lot faster than Michael Phelps. How do they do that? How come they can swim so fast? There's a lot of other Nectin that's not their strategy. They don't swim that fast. We'll look at those later. They swim efficiently, but not necessarily fast. So some of the mechanisms for achieving this fast swimming speed are morphological. So in other words, you streamline your body, make it more efficient to move from point A to point B. You're still suffering in terms of it still takes a lot of energy to get there compared to a blimp, but you can have these different structures that really aid in you moving through the water quickly. So your morphology. And then there's a lot of adaptations that are physiological in terms of the energy, basically, that's powering this ability to swim fast. Your muscles have to contract quickly. Your muscles have to contract powerfully. Basically, your muscles have to pull on your tail this way and pull on your tail that way. Your muscles have to make your tail move back and forth. Now, if you're a killer whale or a dolphin, then of course you're not beating your tail back and forth. You're having your tail go up and down. plus your body is moving in a different way. Either way, it takes a lot of energy, and there's physiological adaptations to doing that. So what do these high-performance swimmers have in common? Well, for mammals, they're warm-blooded. Their body temperature is maintained at a constant level, which requires a lot of energy, high metabolic rate. For these other fast-swimming, high-performance swimming nekton that aren't warm-blooded, some of them are regional endotherms. In other words, they heat parts of their body. They heat their muscle, and then their muscle contracts more powerfully, more efficiently when it's warm compared to when it's cooler. So basically, you have to have a higher metabolic rate, even if you don't heat your body. You've got to generate more energy. You've got to burn more fuel to expend more energy, to have your tail beat back and forth, to move from point A to point B faster. If you're a high-performance swimmer, you have a high metabolic rate, higher metabolic rate. So to support a high metabolic rate, you have to be able to extract more oxygen from the water. So that's one thing. You have to get more oxygen to be involved in cellular respiration. That generating ATP by burning fuel requires oxygen. So if you look at some of the adaptations in terms of getting more oxygen out of the water, one is they've got a bigger surface area of gills. More water in contact with the gills, short distance from their blood, they can extract more oxygen out of the water and get it into their blood, and then distribute that around to the muscles. Two, they've got more red blood cells. You know, red blood cells in vertebrates have hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has a high binding affinity for oxygen. So because they have more red blood cells, more hemoglobin, they can load up a lot more oxygen in their blood than if they have fewer red blood cells and less hemoglobin. So they've got a higher metabolic rate. They've got a better ability to extract oxygen and distribute it around their body. Their muscles can contract fast. Their muscles can contract continuously. And if they heat their body, which also requires more energy to generate metabolic heat, then basically, you know what they can do? They can beat their tail back and forth faster, constantly, and they can swim fast. Well, let's look at this idea of heating your body to be able to swim faster. If you heat part of your body, not your whole body like birds and mammals, but you heat your muscles, basically. These muscles have, it's red muscle as opposed to white muscle, and this red muscle has a number of different characteristics in terms of the enzymes that are there, the ability to use oxygen, the density of red blood cells and mitochondria. All those different things enable red muscle to contract more powerfully, to contract in a sustained manner and pull on their tail back and forth, powerfully, generate forward propulsion, swim fast, be a high-performance swimmer. And if you heat this muscle, then it contracts even more powerfully and more efficient. Enzymes break down energy and catalyze reactions at a faster rate if they're warmer. So look at this list where it says result. What is the result of having warm muscles? More rapidly, more powerfully. The tail is pulled on this way and that way faster, generating more force. You swim faster. If you can swim faster, you can avoid predators. You can capture more prey. If you have a warm body, you can enter into cold water. And there, as a warm-blooded animal, you're doing things at a much faster rate than anybody, all these cold-blooded fish, for instance. So you're basically a super predator. Now, whether you're a marine mammal doing that, you heat your body, your entire body, or whether you're a tuna or a billfish or one of these warm-bodied sharks, then and you don't heat your whole body. Either way, you're able to invade these different parts of the ocean and do things at a much faster rate than especially fish that are cold-blooded. It's like you're moving in fast motion and they're moving in slow motion. Gives you a huge advantage. So let's look at this red mussel. If you look in this figure, there's a cross section of a tuna. And this is like if you cut a tuna in half, cut its head off, and you're looking into its body towards its tail, then its backbone is right in the middle, that black part, and the arrow is pointing to this red mussel. And what do you find in this red mussel? You find myoglobin, which is similar to hemoglobin. You can store a lot of oxygen there, deliver oxygen for metabolic reactions, for burning fuel, basically, generating power, generating ATP, generating heat, all those things. More red blood cells, which means more oxygen. More mitochondria, higher level of enzymes. All of those things are in greater concentrations inside red mussel. And as I said, if you heat that red mussel, then it speeds up all of those reactions even more so. So if you're talking about this red mussel on one side contracting and then red mussel on the other side contracting, the result is their tail is pulled on and they move back and forth. Their tail beats back and forth, generates forward propulsion. Well, with red mussel, you can generate, as it says here in the big blue letters, 6 times more power than fish that only have white mussel. So you can swim continuously. You can swim fast continuously. You can swim faster than anybody else, pretty much. And you can do that without slowing down, without having to stop. So that leads to this ability to go from point A to point B, go from one patch to the other. Not just that, but when you get there, you're very good at catching, eating, whatever it is you want. Well, let's look at this other group, the high efficiency swimmers. Now, these aren't swimming very fast necessarily, but they're swimming very efficiently. So as I said, this example of a blimp versus a jet. You can take a jet across the United States, uses a huge amount of fuel, but of course you can get there in a matter of hours. If you're taking a blimp across the United States, I don't know how much fuel it takes for a jet or for a blimp, but certainly for a blimp it's a tiny little fraction of the amount of gas or jet fuel. You wouldn't even need jet fuel to go all the way across the United States. Very efficiently, a bit of energy. When you travel from one patch to the next, when you're in these patches, you might not be so good at capturing whatever prey that's there. So what do you do when you're a high efficiency swimmer, not a high performance swimmer? That you can move efficiently, you can move from point A to point B with a small expenditure of energy, a lot less energy per unit distance than those high performance swimmers. Of course, it takes longer to get there. And when you get there, you're not the super predator that's warm, that's very fast swimmer. And so that your behavior as a result of that, in terms of feeding, you have to be a lot more opportunistic, feed on a lot of things that you come across, as opposed to saying, I don't want that, I'm not going to eat that. Oh, low energy density. I'm going to wait until I find something like a tuna with a lot of energy. They have to eat whatever they come across, or at least consume a lot more, a wider variety of prey. So what are the adaptations that these types of nekton have? First of all, they've got long fins, they have big lifting surfaces like gliders. They're gliding more than little tiny wings of a jet fighter or little tiny fins of a high performance fish. They're efficient at moving through the water. Their wings or their fins are similar to wings where they provide lift. And they're very efficient at maximizing the amount of distance that they cover per unit energy expended. So they have a low metabolic rate as opposed to a high metabolic rate. They tend to store low density lipids like things besides triglycerides. Triglycerides are mostly what we find in animals, but these are lower density than triglycerides. And so basically, you can go from point A to point B. You can go from a patch here and a patch there with a maximum of efficiency. Maybe not a maximum of speed, but a maximum of efficiency. Well, in terms of feeding, there's a lot of different ways that you can feed. There's Nekton feeds a different way. There's filter feeders that are Nektons. The biggest animals, whale sharks, basking sharks, baleen whales that we looked at, those are all filter feeders. But you can also be a big predator, and you can be a big carnivore. Not so many of those. So in terms of feeding, they're all carnivores. Even a basking shark or a humpback whale, filter feeders, they're eating zooplankton, fish eggs, those kind of things for the most part. So they're carnivores, filter feeders. The largest animals out there are filter feeders, but there's also some of these bait fish that are really, really, really abundant. Menhaden on the U.S. East Coast, herring, those kind of things, anchovies. Those are filter feeders. They filter out zooplankton with their gills. A lot of these are big predators, things like sperm whale that fighting with a giant squid there, killer whales, birds, sharks. There's a whole bunch of different things that are active predators. Some of them are these high efficiency swimmers, and others are the high performance swimmers. So one way or the other, though, there's some mechanism for Nekton to be very good at feeding, whether they're doing it very efficiently or whether they're doing it very high performance wise. Okay, so that takes us through this first part in terms of organisms you find out in the open ocean and our focus on Nekton as opposed to zooplankton or phytoplankton. Now we're going to turn our attention to migration and dispersal. And this is true. Things that are in all these different ecosystems, whether you're talking about an estuary, coral reef, or any of these ecosystems that we've looked at to date, migration and dispersal is important. But it really fits into the oceanic ecosystems. And so that's where we're going to talk about this. Migration and dispersal they're also going to apply to some of these other ecosystems that we've already looked at, not the open ocean, but these coastal ones. But this is the appropriate time to focus on migration and dispersal, and we'll do that in our next lecture.